do all roads lead to God? The first answer I usually give is yes, briefly. Everybody does end up in front of God. Some of them it's a much shorter visit than others. So that's not usually the question that people are asking, though, when they're asking if all roads lead to God. And it's probably not a helpful answer, but here's a passage I think is interesting in 2 Corinthians 10. Though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh. The weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ, being ready to punish every disobedience when your obedience is complete. Fairly familiar passage. What I think is interesting in this passage, though, it talks about weapons of the flesh. Weapons of the flesh obviously are, I mean, like, flesh is kind of an odd word we don't use a whole lot outside of church. But weapons of the flesh, spears, swords, knives, these kind of things. Those are fleshly weapons, things that you use in the physical world. But what in that passage, what examples does it give of strongholds that are in that passage? Now there's other strongholds mentioned elsewhere in the Bible, but in this passage, when it talks about strongholds, what does it, anyone see something?
Arguments and lofty opinions.
Arguments and lofty opinions. So it's talking about these strongholds, spiritual strongholds that exist, are arguments, opinions, thoughts, things like that. What does the passage say to do? What is our participation in this non-fleshly war? What do we do with these arguments and opinions, according to the passage?
Destroying the knowledge of God.
Yeah, we're destroying arguments that are raised against the knowledge of God. And it says to do this by taking every thought captive. And you know, that's a phrase that's used in a number of contexts, not often this one. So I think it's an interesting way of looking at it, that we should, by taking every thought captive, especially in this context, look it over and think this through and see what you think sometime, if this makes sense. I think what Paul's saying here is there are all these ideas that are put out there by the world, by other worldviews, and there's lofty opinions and these claims. So we're supposed to take them captive, think about them, hold them in your head for a minute, roll them over, take them for a test drive, see if they make sense, examine the arguments, and see if they hold up. So, to that end, religious pluralism is a term used to describe the acceptance of all religious paths as equally valid, promoting coexistence. So the claim is, there's more than one way to God, or sometimes to heaven or enlightenment. For our purposes, we're going to be talking about God because that's usually the way the argument goes. That sounds like a lofty opinion to me. So I think it's worth looking at, does this opinion that people give, does it make sense? Does it hold up to scrutiny? There's a couple of stories that people who give this opinion will use to try and prove their point. One of them is the story of the blind man and the elephant. And what they'll do is they'll say, there's these handful of blind guys, and they're trying to understand what an elephant really is. They've never obviously seen one, blind since birth. No one's described it to them. So these guys are led into a room where there's an elephant tethered there. And they all walk in and proceed to a different part of the elephant. And they're observing, feeling different things, smelling things, I'm sure. So they're using their observation to figure out what is an elephant exactly. And they all come back into a room later, and the guy moderating it says, okay, so what is an elephant? Oh, it's massive. It's like a tree. I could barely get my arms around it. It felt very solid. It came right up out of the ground like a tree trunk. And the next guy's going, that doesn't make any sense to me at all. It's more like a rope. It kind of whips around. And I can put my fingers around it. I don't know what you're talking about. An elephant it's like a rope. Another guy goes, you guys are both crazy. I walked up to it. I couldn't find the ends of it. It's like a wall. It's just enormous. And it's rough. And they're all talking about it. And they're coming to different conclusions, different observations. The reason they use this to try and promote pluralism is to say, all we are is a bunch of lowly blind men. We can't observe everything. We can't understand everything. All we can do is take in what we can. So we as individuals are these blind men, or these blind men could also represent religious traditions. So the poor Catholics are, they're a set of blind men, and so are the Buddhists. They all get this little picture, and we all compare our notes, and none of us are getting the full picture. More on that later, but that is the argument they give. It's not really an argument. get to that later too. But that's the parable, the story they use to try and back it up. Another one that you might hear in support of this is the story of people climbing the mountain. Life's about the climb. We're all trying to get to the top, trying to find enlightenment. God's sitting at the top of a mountain, and there's all these mountain pathways, and we're climbing up different ways. Some routes might be more direct, some might, have different terrain, but we're all going the same place, different ways. So they're all equally valid. Put these ways, I guess they sound persuasive to a degree, but they're stories. They're not real good arguments. So what I want to do is look at these, because these are the best they can come up with in support, I think, of their claims. Look at them and see if they hold up, and then look at some possible responses. So, if you're claiming, if we're going to look at the blind man and an elephant analogy, in this analogy, their first challenge is, are us saying that Jesus is the only way to God, that's arrogant. I can't believe you'd be so arrogant as to say your way is right and ours is wrong. But let's tear that apart a little bit and see if it makes sense. In that analogy, in that story, who is the elephant? What does the elephant represent that we're all trying to figure out but only partially? God. So, and to a degree, we agree with that. None of us can comprehend all of God. Sure, we know in part, we see through a glass darkly, all that kind of thing. So a certain part of that resonates with us, but I don't think that's what they're saying. Because they would say we can only know God in part, but I think we can know God. Certainly not fully, but so God is the elephant in the story. Who isn't explicitly mentioned? You've got all these blind guys, and you've got this elephant. There's somebody else participating here that's not mentioned, but is key to the story. Narrator. Somebody's telling the story, right? So you've got this narrator that's telling the story. They're not explicitly mentioned. What does that make the narrator? I mean, just to use some adjectives, it looks like you've got all these poor blind people who can't see the full elephant. The narrator can make these observations though, right? He's sitting back here going, he can see that he's only seeing the leg, he's only seeing the side, he's only seeing the tail. So the narrator is in effect omniscient. He has the ability to see everything. So who's making the arrogant claim in this story? The guy that's telling the story is saying, all of these religions only see in part. Let me explain how it is to you. Wait a minute. So you're going to tell me that you got it all nailed down, but all, millennia has just seen in part, but until you came along. Thank you. And you're saying that our claim is arrogant. Well, let's deal with the claims actually made. Saying something is arrogant, that doesn't get us anywhere. And I think they're making an arrogant claim here as well. Obviously, we shouldn't act arrogantly, but truth itself, if you're making a truth claim, that's not arrogance. If I say 2 + 2 is 4 and somebody else disagrees and says it's 7, and I say, no, that's actually wrong, I can beat them over the head with it and tell them they're wrong, and I can be arrogant about it, but it's not an invalid thing for me to point out the fact that actually 2 + 2 is 4, and I think I can demonstrate that fairly reliably. So if a claim is true, is it really arrogant for me to agree with the truth? Galileo was called arrogant for asserting that the universe revolved around the sun as opposed to the earth. This is not an uncommon thing for people to be called arrogant just because they make a claim that maybe other people don't hold. So the very claim of pluralism fundamentally opposes what we know to be true. It's a nonsensical way to say that that universality and specificity are simultaneously true. In other words, there can be no specific truths that accept all truth claims as equally valid. Just for some examples, not all paths of light lead to purple. If I want to make purple light on a wall or on a computer screen, I combine red and blue. And that's how you get purple light. You can't say, just do whatever you want, all paths of light lead to purple. Not all culinary paths lead to Mexican food. There are certain things, Mexican food entails certain things. If it's not spicy and doesn't have cornmeal and a shell and all these kind of things, but you say, well, it is Mexican food, but it's a fruit salad. Yeah, but it's Mexican food. There are things that are specific enough that you can't just include everything. Challenge 2, claiming that all other ways are illegitimate is intolerant. But if you think about it, when somebody says that you're intolerant, aren't they being just as intolerant? Because they're not accepting your view as equally valid. So they're saying, no, I accept all other views but yours. Well, then you're not intolerant. I'm not sure how tolerance or intolerance, as far as accepting views as valid, I'm not sure how that's a virtue just by itself. Maybe we should just look at the truth claims and see whether they make sense. Saying all religious paths lead to God is like saying that all exits off all highways lead to the same Cracker Barrel. That it doesn't matter how you go, you're always going to get there. But we know that's not true in anything else. Why do we buy GPSs if we think that however we strike out to get somewhere, that we're going to end up where we desire to be? Well, this desire isn't enough to get us there. Every view about every topic excludes opposing views. Even the pluralist who says all roads lead to God will be outraged by my position that only Jesus does. And I might be wrong. That's something I think is good to be clear on when we're talking to people about these kind of things, is be quick to say, maybe I'm wrong, but I think there's good reasons to believe this. And that's where we go over the things like we talked about last week. I think there are good reasons. But you can't say that both views are right. So, what do we mean by tolerance? Does it mean we accept everything as valid and true, or does it just mean we're respectful and willing to listen? If the latter, I think we can all agree. Let's tolerate each other, and I think we already do that. If we don't, then we ought to. We ought to listen to people and have these discussions. But if it's the former, to just say that we accept everything to be valid and true and don't test it out, it's just a statement that can be made so it's true, we're going to have a difficult time having a rational conversation about anything. Tolerance is not a virtue if it requires uncritical acceptance of false positions. So, something I mentioned earlier, these stories they've given as examples, the elephant and the mountain. These are things, what I think is helpful is to explain, these are analogies, not arguments. They're not setting up an argument with facts that lead to a conclusion. They're just telling a story that may or may not be true. Obviously with the blind man and the elephant, that's got some major flaws. With the mountain illustration, that's got some problems too. If you picture a mountain with all these trails leading up it, if that were true, isn't it possible for people to be heading down those same trails? So isn't it possible that people could be circling the mountain, or maybe there's other mountains or valleys in between? So how much do you want to extend this story? I think it points out that it just doesn't work. The problem is that stories are not arguments, they're just stories. And if what they're explaining isn't true, then there's really no point in it. Paul Copan makes a suggestion to illustrate the problem with using an analogy like they do. Let's switch the analogy. If Jesus is truly unique, maybe the world's religions are all like a maze or labyrinth with one way out. What if God in Christ steps into this maze to help us walk through it? Okay, here's another analogy. Why should I accept your analogy as true if you won't accept mine? Can we talk about this as maybe being a possible option? The truth is, arrogance and intolerance, those kind of issues are red herrings. They're just throwing something out there to kind of try and take us off track, to take us off the real issue. So here are some approaches that I think would be helpful to, a few different ways we could use to illustrate with people that pluralism has some problems. And these are all, it's kind of like arguments for the existence of God. It's not necessarily a, slam somebody with all of these. If they're just, and this is certainly not a definitive list either. There's going to be other ones, I'm sure. But here are just a handful that I've come up with that you could use in discussion with somebody and say, okay, I hear what you're saying, that you think all paths lead to God, but here's some questions I have, and maybe one of these might strike you as working with somebody better than another. We talked about worldviews before. And a worldview is a way of looking at the world, and it answers questions about how you see the world. And one way of putting it is that a worldview answers three basic questions. How did I get here? What went wrong? And what can we do to fix it? Or is there a solution? So, obviously you can see some parallels, some obvious answers that Christianity has for those three questions. And other worldviews are going to have different answers. So, if we're comparing worldviews, if we have two different worldviews, say we're looking at Christianity and Buddhism, or theism and atheism, you're taking two different worldviews, do they answer things the same? So do they answer the question of how we got here the same? Well, I think atheists and theists would disagree on how we got here. I think that Buddhists and Christians are going to disagree on what the solution is. So if we disagree on these fundamental issues, then we're not talking about the same thing. We're talking about different things. And that's okay. That just means now we've got a discussion to have about which worldview is more valid. So at this point, I'm more interested in illustrating that worldviews are different. Religions are different. They don't all teach the same thing differently. They are fundamentally different. And we'll deal with the individual religions over time as we go through this. Another way is to compare notions of God. Atheism says there's no God. Agnosticism doesn't want to answer the question. Pantheism says God is the universe. Pantheism says God is in the universe. Deism says that God showed up and walked away. Eastern religions say we're God. There's numerous gods. Theism, Christianity is one, says God is a personal being who may be known. Well, those are a whole bunch of very different positions. They can't all be true at the same time in the same way. That doesn't make any sense. So it's possible that they're all wrong, but it's not possible that they're all true. Maybe one of them's true, but they can't all be true. Another interesting aspect, if theism is true, and as I mentioned, theism just means belief in God, a personal God. Christianity is a form of theism. If Christianity is true, then God is a knowable person. Persons have opinions on things. Opinions are specific things. So someone has an opinion, they're going to have preferences, or things they like and don't like, things that they accept and don't accept. So if God is a personal being, he is going to have preferences. He's going to have things that he doesn't like. So we can't say everything goes. He probably has a good idea of what goes. Whether that's what we think it is, that's another discussion. But to say that, well, he'll just let anything go, that's hard to believe. I don't know any personal beings that just accept anything as being equally valid. What did Jesus say about pluralism? Since we're coming from a Christian perspective, I think it's worth looking at what he said. He said that he was the way, the truth, and the life. The way. He mentioned there are multiple paths. There's narrow paths and wide paths. He used a lot of that kind of language. He talks about doors and things. He was quite clear that these paths led to different places. So according to Jesus, Christianity is a religion that excludes all others. He wasn't confused on the issue. Now, maybe he was wrong. Maybe he wasn't the Son of God. That's, again, another topic that we talked about last week. But if you want to say pluralism is true and Christianity teaches that too, well, Jesus is kind of the main guy in Christianity. And he doesn't seem to believe that all worldviews, religions were on the same footing. There's also a number of logical issues we can look at, just with contradictory statements. Just look at a few issues like Jesus, the issue of Jesus, the person of Jesus. Jews say he didn't rise. Islam says that he didn't die. Christianity says he died and rose. You can't have all those at the same time. On afterlife, Christianity teaches that we're eternal beings. Buddhism says we cease to exist. Hinduism says we're reincarnated. I'm not sure how you can have any two of those at the same time. In the end, Christianity says our bodies will be restored. Stoicism says that our spirits join the ether, they join the universe. Jainism and other Eastern religions say that body and soul are snuffed out. That's what nirvana is. It's actually interesting, the concept of nirvana, we're trying to reach nirvana, it sounds like enlightenment or some higher plane. Actually, the word nirvana means snuffed out. So what the concept is you have this cosmic consciousness or whatever that you're appeasing, it's not a personal force, is somehow, it's not a personal being, but it's looking at you. Have you gotten far enough? Have you suffered enough? Have you learned enough? If you have, you've gotten to the point where you have arrived, okay, now it's the end of the pain and you cease to exist and you're snuffed out. That's what nirvana means. It's not a high level of something we ought to want to attain. It's just finally I can get off the ride. Happy thoughts. The soul. Christianity teaches what's called substance dualism, just a fancy word that means we have a body and a soul. Materialism holds to monism, which means singularity, where meat all the way down. All that exists is material, matter. So if all that exists is matter, what is it that's thinking and memories and these kind of things? It seems, one argument for dualism would be something like I can conceive of the possibility that I could be disembodied, okay? Whether it's true or not. But I can't conceive of the possibility that my body could be disembodied. That doesn't make any sense, right? So, it sounds like I and my body are two different things in some sense. So that's what substance dualism is getting at. There is, obviously, we do have matter to us. We have a body, but we also have an immaterial soul, whatever you'd like to call it. You can't have a body and soul, or just have a body. They can't happen at the same time. Either there's a soul or there's not. Even with existence, New Age and Eastern religions see much of our existence as illusory. And that's what the word Maya means in Hindu, I believe it is. That word means it's an illusion. Pain is an illusion. That's an interesting thing. When you look in India or other Hindu countries, you won't find relief agencies or whatever. You won't find a Red Cross or a soup kitchen, whatever, unless they're from other worldviews, usually Christianity, that have been imported from another country. But you won't find Hindu relief agencies because they see, number one, because you keep coming back, you probably deserve this, and two, it's an illusion. There is no such thing as pain, so why should we relieve somebody from an illusion? It's not real anyway. So either things are real, which it seems that they are, and it seems to make sense, or they're not real. They can't both be. So those are just examples of things that are religious beliefs held by different religions that directly contradict each other. So they may or may not be true, but they can't all be true. And this, I thought, was an interesting quote by John DePoe. In essence, pluralism can allow fundamentally different religious claims to be true, in the sense that they are true of each religion's understanding of God, only if these claims are not taken to be actually true of the divine reality itself. By altering the nature in which all of these central propositions of all the major religions are understood to be true, we see that pluralism requires each religion to change so radically that we no longer recognize each religion once the pluralist is done with it. Ironically, pluralism destroys each religion in an attempt to save them all. You see what he's saying? In order to make pluralism make sense, they have to say, well, what Jesus really meant when he said this was this. Well, what the Buddhists really believe is this. And they end up deconstructing the religions so much in order to make them match each other that no adherent of any of the religions would agree with what they just said. The version of Buddhism you just told me, that's not what I believe, the Buddhists would say. Christians, that's not the version of Christianity I've ever heard. You're making something up in order to make your argument. Something Greg Koukl calls the suicide tactic is when an argument is self-refuting. You don't really need to put up an argument against it because it killed itself. Here is how the argument for religious pluralism commits suicide. If all religions are true, then Christianity is true, right? Because they said all religions are true. Christianity is a religion. So if all religions are true, Christianity is true. If Christianity is true, then Jesus is the only way. If Jesus is the only way, then not all religions are true. You have a problem. So you could say all religions except Christianity are true, and then go through a process of weeding out all the others. But then that's not terribly helpful because your original claim is gone now. The original claim of pluralism itself is nonsensical too. This we've covered somewhat already with these logical contradictions. When it comes to just the issue of God, he's either one of a kind, there's one God, he's one of many, like the Greek pantheon, or he doesn't exist at all, like atheism says. We can't have all of those be. Jesus either was God in the flesh or he wasn't. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe that's something that's a claim that has to be backed up on both sides. But you can't have them both be the case. God is either a personal being or he's not. He can't be a trinity and an antiquated notion. To this claim of religious pluralism, author Steve Turner wrote the following. We believe that religions are basically the same. They only differ on matters of creation, sin, heaven, hell, God, and salvation. Which is true. In other words, the only things that religions disagree on are the things that actually matter. Yeah. Another interesting point, the problem that the cross presents. A friend of mine online proposed this one, named Tom Gilson. If you think of what we talked about last week, about the resurrection arguments, I'm just going to pull 3 facts that are almost universally accepted from those. Not that people agree, not that all scholars agree that Jesus died and rose and that Christianity is the true, that the resurrection hypothesis is the true solution. But these facts are agreed on. Jesus died on a cross. There's no one that disputes that. Jesus claims to be God. Very few people dispute that. The belief that God died is central to Christianity. That was in the earliest creeds. So, and just to be clear here, we're not saying we believe in the cross, therefore that proves the cross. We're not trying to make an argument there. We're just saying Jesus died on a cross, Jesus claimed to be God, and those two combined, that combined belief is what founded Christianity. If pluralism is true, and we want to say that Jesus died on a cross for all of our sins, but there were other ways, what kind of a God does that make God? Jesus' death was unnecessary, if that's true. It was just he wanted to provide another way for who knows what reason. And this other way that he decided to come up with was to humiliate, belittle, torture, and kill his son. If that wasn't necessary, then why on earth would he do it? And if that were true, if it were said that pluralism were true and God did this, it's not a God anybody's going to want to worship. It's not a good God. So it presents a problem. I think Christianity solves the problem nicely. Pluralism doesn't really have anything to offer on that. So, something I mentioned a few times throughout, but just to review here. It's possible in pluralism, all these claims across all the world's religions, we might all be wrong. That's logically possible. But it's not possible that we could all be right. That just can't be. Therefore, pluralism is false. So, in practice, I think it's possible that many of us live, even though we see the bumper sticker and we don't believe that all those are true religions. However, in a sense, I think oftentimes we live as if it were true. Because if we don't make any claim outside of our own head that Christianity is true, we've kind of conceded their point just by not having the discussion with anyone. So I think that's a fair thing to consider sometimes, that if we're not countering that claim ever, then we've kind of given in. I'm not suggesting you make a sign and take it down to Cherry Festival. I think that's a bad idea. But I think that we ought to enter the conversation. I think that if someone makes the claim that all religions are equally valid, that it's fair to say, what do you mean by that? What do you mean they're valid? How are they equal? And maybe using some of these examples or questions. But talk to them, draw them out, ask them what they mean, make them put their claim out on the table, test it out, see if it makes sense, and find out what they believe. In doing so, you'll be showing them respect, you'll be including them, you're saying, I'm not just going to go with what I think pluralism is, I want to know what you think about this. Tell me why you think this makes sense. And if you do that, I don't know how they can use the tolerant or arrogant claim against you. You're drawing them out, you're letting them do all the talking, so you've disarmed that right off the bat, so I don't think they can use that. But then after that, if you're actually engaging with people, eventually it's going to come around. Okay, you've asked me all these questions, what do you think? They just ask you to share the gospel with them. You might as well. You don't have to go and lead with it and beat somebody over the head, because it's probably not going to go well. They're not going to be that interested probably. But if you have this kind of discussion where someone else has made a claim, you ask them about it, you point out that you don't think it makes sense, they're going to say, okay, hotshot, what do you think? Well, okay, how about something like this? It seems to me that we might all be wrong, but it's not possible that we're all right. Therefore, I think that we have to come to the conclusion that pluralism is false. And personally, I've looked into it a bit, I think that there are good reasons to believe that Christianity is true, and I'd be curious to see what you think of them. Are you interested in listening? Then there's a number of ways to go after it. And one is the minimal facts approach we talked about last week for the resurrection. Whatever that happens to be, that you've got an opportunity then to lay out your reasons that you believe that theism, specifically Christianity, is true. And I think that they will most likely be receptive to it because you've gotten to this point with them. And then at the end, if they think your reasons are valid, then the conclusion that they have to make, I think, is that Jesus is the only way to God. If not, if the arguments aren't valid, then we're both in trouble, and we ought to both be seeking truth as opposed to just trying to perpetuate our truth claim. So, and that's the thing I always like to do in arguments too, is when you're having a discussion with somebody, I say all the time, I might be all wet. This could be wrong, but I think it's right. It seems to make sense to me. I'm interested in the truth. So feel free to challenge me. There's probably a lot of things I'm not going to have answers to. I'm going to have to go look, and maybe they're not going to be real persuasive answers. Maybe they're still going to be difficult questions. Problem of pain, things like that are difficult to answer. However, I'm interested in pursuing the truth. I'm not interested in dogma, indoctrination, propaganda. I'm not just going to wave tracts at you that tell the Christian message. I want to pursue the truth because I think if Christianity is true, we're going to get there. If we're pursuing truth, Jesus said he was the truth. We're going to get to Christ if we're making arguments based on seeking truth. We don't need to hold to, well, I'm going to stick on this and draw our battle lines, and then nobody's going to have a conversation. So, in closing for this part, I don't think we have any reason to fear other people on these kind of topics. The fact is we're already coexisting with other religions. They're all around us already. Some established and many homemade ones these days. So because we're coexisting with them, we're already tolerating them. So why not take advantage of it and have some discussions that might end up leading to some good places. Maybe even be some eternal consequences brought from those questions. Any questions, thoughts on that before Anthony takes over? Yeah?
Maybe I'm all wet, as you would say, but if you know what is true, and you're having a conversation with someone, I mean, there's obviously things in the Bible that, we believe as truth, and you're talking to someone and they have this outgoing conversation with you, and totally taking it out of context. With my strong personality, I like to beat them over the head with the Bible and tell them what part of this don't you get, but I try to control myself. So you just continue to have that conversation over and over again, or just say what you believe? And
Sure. There's a lot of different approaches to that. And in apologetics, there's different versions of apologetics. Different people take different things to be true as a starting point. Presuppositions, they call them. Many people will start from the standpoint that the Bible is true, there is a God, and we're going to start talking from that perspective, which I don't disagree with, that is true. However, if you're talking to somebody that doesn't concede those things,
Right.
then it's probably not a helpful place to start because they're already entrenched in their position.
Right.
So the place I tend to go, I don't, especially in the beginning, in those kind of conversations, I rarely use the Bible.
Okay.
Just because it's, if they were to appeal to their book that they think holds all truth, I'm going to kind of shrug it off too. So there's a few different approaches. One is just to decide that the Bible's true and you're going to accept it or not. Another one is start with giving evidences for why you think the Bible is true. And if they concede that, then say, okay, here's something the Bible says, and we've agreed that there's good reason to believe that this is a reliable book to look at. That's an approach too. I typically don't use that one either. I would look at things like, well, it depends on what the topic is, but I often start with, is there a God? And look at a bunch of the different arguments for whether there's a God, because once they have to concede the point that it's possible, that it's maybe even likely, but certainly possible, there's no way to say it's impossible if there's a God, and there are good arguments that God exists. Once they say that, if you then move to the point and argue that God is a personal God that has expressed himself to humanity, which I think there are good arguments made for that. If that's the case, then you could say, well, wouldn't it be odd if this all-powerful being existed, he was a personal agent who could express himself, and he didn't? I think it's reasonable to think that he may have. We have this book that a good chunk of the world throughout history has thought came from him. It's probably worth looking at. Now, that's not a conversation. That's a lot of conversations to get to that point. But that's typically what I do, because when you have these presuppositions like that,
They're going to be turned on.
exactly. All it takes is hitting a roadblock like that, and people are shut down. That's why I think it's good to start from the standpoint, whatever the topic is you're talking about, asking a bunch of questions. And they say something they believe, I believe all roads lead to God. Really, tell me more about that. What do you mean by that? And kind of tease it out. Then you find out pretty quickly what things they'll agree with you on and what they don't. So then you know where to start, rather than digging in somewhere where they're going to you know, ignore what we have to say anyway. Does that make sense?
I think it seems like, perhaps it stems from our timidity or something, but I think we're often more interested in winning an argument than winning the person. And so winning the argument rushes to the Bible, makes all the bold statements, draws a line in the sand, and then we end up walking away from each other. But winning people often requires us to let the argument hang in the air for a long time.
Right. And, you know, a lot of times, winning the person, what does that mean? I've got a number of atheist friends I talk to pretty regularly. And I don't feel like I wouldn't say that I've persuaded them on anything or made them, you know, change their ways. So I haven't won the person in that sense, but they come back and say, I enjoy talking these things over with you because you have good arguments, you're not irrational, we can have these discussions, you don't just blow me off, ask me what I mean, let me say it, and don't just say, well, you're an atheist, so you're an idiot, or you believe in these horrible things. You let me say what I believe, and we talk back and forth, and we usually disagree on most things, but because we're having this ongoing discussion, it promotes a relationship that you can build on, and yeah, it can only be good. I don't know how that can go wrong.
Sometimes, you know, as hard as it is sometimes for us, even as, you know, if you read the Bible a lot, sometimes it's hard for us to defend our faith. It's also very hard for them to defend what they believe. And so when you start asking them questions about what they believe, it's very hard for them to defend those concepts that they have, or the non-concept of God. So it puts the onus on them, and you're not trying to beat them over the head. You're just saying, okay, what do you really believe and why do you believe that? Explain it to me.
Right.
And it's very difficult for them to do that.
Sure. I like the approach Greg Kokel talks about, putting a stone in people's shoe. The concept is, I want to give them something. I don't want to give them a big chunk. Just lay down all the doctrines of Christian faith, you know, and start going through Luther, and, you know, I'm not going to do that. I want to give them an irritation. I want to give them something that's going to wear away at them. So over time, they're going to be thinking, I disagree with this, but something rings true, or I can't write it off easily. Why? So it's a stone in their shoe. They're going to walk around, they're going to work, doing whatever, and it's in the back of their head, and they're going to keep working on that, trying to figure it out. And I think that's our best option for scoring points. And hopefully, the other point I like is, I think it was Wayne Corduan that said, he always is looking forward to the next conversation. If you're thinking in terms of, I want to meet him again for coffee, or talk to him at work again, or have this phone call, if what I want to say right now will make him not want to talk to me again, it's not a good choice. So, you know, thinking in terms of giving them something to chew on and looking forward to that next conversation. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's why I'm here, so I'll be more
Yes, sir.
A couple months ago, Scott hooked me up with a podcast online by a guy named Justin Brierly, who's over in England, and he hosts debates a lot. And the one that was up this week, maybe this is something we can find a link to publicize in some way, was a really brilliant example of a discussion between a Christian and an atheist about how to take claims that are made and kind of turn them around and help people see how things self-destruct, or how they don't make sense, or they're not workable in real life. It was probably the best one I've heard. It was brilliant. And between two guys who are, for good reason, representing a large group of people on both sides of the debate, it was fantastic.
And this is the most recent one you're talking about? I just listened to the beginning, but on that one, you said the gloves came off, right? It was pretty much a no holds barred, call names, be irritable. And I think the Christian said, you want to play that way? Fine. I mean, if that's how you want to do it, I wouldn't lead with that, but usually the debates you hear, the discussions on those kind of forums are very civil, almost amusingly civil. Watching these people who disagree very strongly call each other very polite names. But on this one, this is a very different way of doing things. It is very interesting to hear these different approaches. And Justin's show is a really cool one because he's got a very broad listening audience of Christians and atheists. And he's a Christian, but he picks people on both sides that disagree strongly, and lets them have at it and moderates it very well, so that He's not a ringer for either side, and you know, people from both sides want to be on his show. It's a great show. If you're interested in podcasts, listening to things like that, there is on the site that's on the card, tcapologetics.org. If you search podcasts or something, you'll find a list of 30 or 40 podcasts that I've got up there that I listen to pretty regularly, and that's one of them. His is called Unbelievable, but yeah, all kinds of them up there if you're interested.